Hey guys, welcome back to DIY guitar making. We're going to do a Q&A here. I am waiting for my extraordinarily buggy and slow tablet to load the page here so I can read your questions. In the meantime, I will just yammer on about this and that. So, before we get into the Q&A, a little bit about what is going on currently at the shop. I am still working on those two parlor guitars. I'm definitely a little bit behind. I'm trying to catch up right now. I'm at the point where I'm doing what is, I think, my favorite part of the build. That's always kind of a moving target. Sometimes I like doing one thing as opposed to another, and then that flip-flops. But right now, and for the last several builds, it really has been doing the binding and purfling schemes and just mating up all those little miters between, say, the end wedge and the side purfling. And if there's a cutaway, doing those binding and purfling miters are really just enjoyable to do, to execute, especially when you execute them well, which hopefully is most of the time. And yeah, I've got, you'll be seeing videos on all this, but I've got some cool little sandwiches I've made here, purfling sandwiches. So I've been playing around a lot with making my own purfling designs. Before that, I was just like most of you guys probably are, I was just ordering from StewMac or LMI, or so there's a couple other sources too. I talked about Gurian Instruments before. In fact, that's where I got the individual components of this. But anyway, I've been working on making my own purfling strips like this, using that jig that I showed you guys in previous videos. Actually, I have it set up right here. It's basically like a little joining board. Tall, skinny joining board specifically for making side purfling onto binding strips, and also making purfling strips using usually that dyed fiber strip material. This one happens to be, the white is maple, so it's not a fiber strip, that's actual solid wood, that's maple. And on the inside, it's dyed poplar. Okay, so that's also solid wood, not a fiber material. But I'm not opposed to using the dyed fiber strips. I think those actually look really beautiful. Okay. This tablet, man. It still hasn't loaded. It's a very old tablet. It's a Samsung, I don't know if it tells you on here what generation it is, but it's super duper old. Alright, so I'll actually pause the video and then I'll just come back when it's ready. But just giving you a little update on where I am in the shop. You'll see some videos coming out soon on, I think I'm going to do a really good and kind of deep video on doing those miters that I was just talking about, which is a job that a lot of people struggle with. So look out for that one. Alright, when I come back, questions. Alright, it's working. Okay, thank you guys for your patience. Alright, so the first question we have comes from Racer X, and he writes, so I need some advice on this particular subject. I have no experience in woodworking or woodshop whatsoever, but I am thinking about enrolling into a school to learn this specific trade. The question is it worth at least looking into the school, or do I need to find an apprenticeship program? Which would be better for me, for someone who has no experience in this field whatsoever? Okay, so I'm going to answer this two ways. I'm going to answer it sort of the Luthier way, because this is a Luthier show. But you were asking about woodworking, and actually that's a really good way, even if you are trying to get into, like I'm not sure, based on your question, if you're interested in getting into guitar making and Luthier ultimately, or if you're interested in just being a woodworker, and maybe guitar making is, you know, one of many things you do. Either way, though, honestly, if you are trying to get into lutherie and you don't have any shop type experience at all, going to something like, what comes to mind for me is the Jeffrey Lohr School of Woodworking. I think a couple years ago he sold the school, or maybe even shut it down completely. I don't know. But that's a school that's in Pennsylvania. It's a woodworking school, nothing to do with guitar making. But from what I understand, you're learning very important basics having to do with how wood functions and using power tools correctly and safely. You know, all geared towards fine woodworking and not towards, like, you know, hobbyist DIY kind of stuff. So that kind of thing, I think, really puts you ahead if you do something, if you have the time to put aside and the money to invest in something like that. Now, on the lutherie side, if you're trying to get into guitar making, some fantastic schools, and I'll talk about what I do here too, but honestly, that might not be what you're looking for, judging by how you're asking the question. The best kind of big programs out there for lutherie are Roberto Venn and the Gallup School of Lutherie. The Gallup School is in Michigan, I believe. I always mix up Michigan and Minnesota. I think they're in Michigan. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. Roberto Venn is in Arizona. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. So, depending on what side of the country you're on, or maybe you're in a different country, I don't know. But I'm going to answer this for USA. Depending on which side of the country you're on, you have those two options, and those are long programs. Oh, there's also, I think it's in California, Charles Fox, the American School of Lutherie. That's another longer program. We're talking several weeks to several months, okay? What I teach here, I teach one week workshop plus 2 extra days. So it's a 9-day workshop. We do it all at once. There's no weekend break or anything like that. So it's really like a intense, immersive experience into lutherie, which you can take even with no experience whatsoever. I've designed the course to work with students who have no prior experience with shop tools or anything like that. It's almost 100% a hand tool course here. We do a little bit of things with power tools. So that it being a hand tool course, it's more conducive to have people with no experience in the shop working with those tools, safety-wise. You know, we're not running things through the table saw. But, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, let's see, your question, okay, you were also asking about apprenticeships. So the thing about apprenticeships, you know, apprenticing is basically working for free. Sometimes you get paid a little bit, but usually and traditionally, an apprentice works under a master builder, either for some woodworking craft or in guitar making, and in exchange for their free labor, they are learning things, okay? Now, becoming an apprentice is few and far between. It's hard to get into something like that, but if there was a great builder, and that's another thing too, you don't want to be an apprentice for, but any builder who needs an apprentice, if you can get that, that's the #1 leg up, I would say, because that's real world experience. Even to the point where, you know, if they're asking you to sweep the shop floor or something like that, you are learning what actually goes on day to day in a shop, rather than when you go to a school, everything's very sort of laid out and formulaic, and this is, you know, we're going to teach you this, then we're going to teach you that. You're not actually experiencing the day-to-day sort of business side of how it runs in a real world where things have to get done. So the apprenticeship, if you can get that, is number one. You said apprenticeship program. I'm not exactly sure what that means, and within Luthier, I don't know if maybe Roberto Venn calls it an apprenticeship program, but when I hear apprentice, I think of just becoming an apprentice. I guess in certain countries they do have programs for that sort of thing. I know, for example, in Germany, there's actually accreditation to be a luthier. To work on guitars, you need to have some sort of accreditation. What's nice about being in the United States is there's no such thing. There's no regulating body of luthiery, no official one that, you know, rubber stamps whether or not you can be a luthier. I think that's great. I'm glad I live here rather than in Germany or somewhere where I would have to jump through those hoops. So, long story short, apprenticeship, if you can find one, call luthiers or contact, email them and see if they're interested or looking for, you know, free labor, essentially. And you might get lucky. I will say, though, I think those are hard spots to get, few and far between, especially if it's a really well-known builder. And other than that, I would say, yeah, find a woodworking school like the Lohr School of Woodworking that will sort of inoculate you with the proper experience you need to get started, because that's the hard part if you literally have nothing to go off of. And there's so many different avenues of learning that you can go down within luthiery and within woodworking, that it's hard to find that like solid foundation to start on. And I think a woodworking school, in some sense even better than a school of luthiery, will give you that base foundation of, here are all the major pieces of equipment and tools and hand tools, and here's some different information about using those in the most effective way possible and the safest way possible. That way you're not just buying a bunch of tools and either ruining your tools or putting yourself into harm's way. That's all I'm going to say about that. I guess I should mention, I said I was going to mention, I'm a school as well, but I'm different from those more semester-like schools. So if you go to the Gallup School or Roberto Venn, again, it's just a longer, it's like a semester of learning. What I do is an immersive 9-day, we're building an acoustic flat top guitar in those 9 days. We're working long hours. Currently, at this time, it's about 11 hours a day, every day. So it's about 8 a.m. to, say, 6:30 is when we usually call it quits for the day. So we're packing a lot of learning into a little over a week. And at the end of the week, you have built a guitar from start to finish. Almost, I should say, because there's a couple things that I prefab a little bit before the class starts, just to make it fit within that 9-day frame. And then also on the other end, we are not applying a finish to the guitar. You end up with a strung up and completely playable and complete instrument in the white, as they say. In the white simply means with no finish. And then I give you instructions to apply a true oil finish, nice clean video instructions to apply a true oil finish at home on your own time, because in a 9-day class we simply can't fit finishing. It just takes, I mean, it can take a week or more in and of itself to finish a guitar with all the time between coats and everything like that. So yeah, there's the immersive style experience that I offer. There's the longer semester style experience where you need to commit the time and the money and travel somewhere and then live there for a time, but that's a hell of an experience. And then there's woodworking schools, and finally the number one thing, hard to get, apprenticeships. All right, next question. Walter Ryder. I love Walter Ryder. He always asks great questions and good comments. let's see, I'm not sure if there's a question or a comment. Thank you, Eric. Those Steinberger tuners look interesting. Have you considered using canary wood for a guitar? I have not. I don't know anything about canary wood, but Walter's going to tell us about it right here. Hardness is 1520 trans. Trans is 4.5. Okay, hardness. So Janka hardness is 1520. I forget what the units are off the top of my head for that. And I don't know what he means by trans at the moment. Lots of color should be interesting. Would it have to be quarter sawn? Well, I mean, I will say nothing has to be quarter sawn. Quarter sawn is, I mean, unless it's really unstable wood. Nothing has to be quarter sawn, basically. It's optimal that it is quarter sawn, but one, almost nothing is perfectly quarter sawn all the way across. So you have to lower your expectations a little bit. And then also nowadays, some certain species are harder to source, and so we accept, you know, more off-quarter material. And yes, and the other thing too is, I'm sure he's talking about for a back plate here. For the back, I mean, I use rift sawn or, you know, heavily rift sawn material all the time for backs, and sometimes I do it intentionally because it looks cooler. You get sort of a cathedral figure on the visible aesthetic portion of the back plate. Because the thing is, that quarter sawn thing is far more important and more meaningful for the soundboard. For the back plate, I personally feel it's much more forgiving to use just whatever you want to use for the back plate, aesthetically speaking. Okay, so I will use if you're using canary wood, I would just use whatever piece strikes your eye, regardless of whether it's more rift sawn or perfectly quarter sawn. That's just my opinion. I think maybe some other people would be more sticklers for the quarter sawn on the back plate. Okay, Mark Pell, I really like your layout geometry of the tuner hole locations. Thank you. I appreciate getting that kind of feedback because it's definitely a quirky thing. Nice straight longitudinal string path over the nut. Yep, that's the idea. Reminiscent of a PRS, actually, but without copying. Although I'm not a PRS fanboy, I appreciate the reasons for doing this, and it's a nice aesthetic touch for your instruments. Kind of quirky and has its own beauty. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm not a PRS fanboy either, but I am a fan of the idea of having the straight run over the nut, which is more than just aesthetic. It kind of looks cool because it's something different. We're so used to seeing the strings meet the nut and then pull to the side to then meet the tuners. We're so used to that it kind of stands out when you actually see the strings just running straight to those tuners. And I think there's something it says in your brain that it triggers your mind to think like, oh, this was engineered. Like something a little extra was done here to line this up, rather than throwing the tuners to the side and just letting the strings turn however much they have to get there. But anyway, the function of the straight pull is actually to conserve string energy. So when the strings come up, meet the nut, and then pull to the side, what you have then is actually two force vectors. You have a side pull, so there's tension and thus energy being sort of wasted by the fact that the string is being pulled to the side, and then you have the down force vector against the nut, which has to do with the fact that there is a angle of the headstock, right? That's the whole reason why the headstock is angled, to turn the strings down like this. Even on a non-angled headstock like a Fender, there's a string tree that grabs the strings and pulls it down at an angle. So that downward force vector is very important for the overall sustain of the instrument. And people give a lot of thought to that angle for that reason. But what I think they don't give a lot of thought to is the fact that you're wasting some of that string's energy by pulling it to the side, when you could be putting all of that force vector straight down against the nut rather than wasting it on side pull. Okay, that was just a nice comment, not really a question, and I appreciate it very much, Mark Pell. Larry Kuhn writes, I assume that was just a Dremel and the StewMac Precision router base I saw you using to carve the side slots. I like that idea for depth control. I've just been using a chisel for this job. So he's talking about a video I did recently, and I at one point in the video was showing how I notched the kerfing and sides, the rims, to fit the brace ends into, to create those little joints between the brace ends and the sides. And so I use a router to do this. I used to use a little Dozuki saw and a chisel, and that's a fine way of doing it. In fact, that's the way I teach in my online course. I show you guys how to do it with hand tools like that. But the reason I like using a Dremel for this, and what you didn't see in that video, Larry, is that I actually have two Dremels, and they're basically like a team, okay? They're like sister Dremels. They work in tandem with each other. The one Dremel is set up to cut those notches, like you saw, to a very precise depth, which is 0.115 inches. And then I have another Dremel with these little insert pads on the base to lift the Dremel up and create a channel down the middle. And that Dremel is set up for the inverse. So it's set up to cut, instead of cutting down 0.115, it's set to be negative 0.115, I guess is one way to put it. And that is used to cut the brace ends. So I don't just chisel straight down to the exact height of my brace ends. I chisel close to it, and then I take that secondary Dremel and I run that over the brace ends to get a uniform height on every brace end, so that then when I cut the channels with the notch cutting Dremel, it will be a perfect machine precision fit, rather than one where I'm relying on my own hand and eye to get them just perfect. I really like doing it that way, and it's just a small investment of getting two Dremels, which are cheap, instead of having one, because I have those two Dremels permanently set up to do those tasks. I don't take the bits out and change the bases or anything like that. Okay. Oh, here's another one from Walter Ryder. Is angle of attack the term you were looking for on the chisel? I have a question, please. On the worksharp, I have one. It works fine on my chisels, but tends to round off my plane blades. Any suggestions? I use the bottom of the disc. Any suggestions? I use the bottom of the disc, not the top. I'm not sure what he means there, except that you're supposed to use the bottom of the disc to get the bevel side, to flatten the bevel side of your plane blades. I sharpen my plane blades and my chisels the exact same way on the worksharp. There's no difference. So I'm not sure exactly what you're experiencing, why you would be having that problem with the plane blades and not the chisels. If anything, the plane blade is easier to sharpen. And I'm talking about just following the exact instructions for the worksharp, meaning flattening the flat side of your plane blade or chisel on the top of the disc, and then using the little ramp on the underside that sets your bevel angle, using that to get the bevel. Walter, I don't know if you're trying to use the top side to do both the flat part of the blade and flipping it over for the bevel, which it's possible to do that, but there'd be a lot of control that you'd have to have with your hand, and it wouldn't be necessary because it's really designed. You should be able to take that plane blade and put it on the ramp underneath the disc and do it that way. But essentially, I'm answering your question by just telling you what the how that tool is meant to be used in a standard way. So if you're using it in some other non-standard way, stop doing it. Yeah, I don't know why you're getting it to round over. You might be popping the end back when you exit. It's very easy to do that. So when you place it, let's go with the bevel side. When you're flattening the bevel side and you place it on the little ramp and then push it up and the grit hits, right? And then when you pull it off, because you're only supposed to have it on there for about 2 seconds, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, there's no water in this system to cool it or oil or anything like that. So to avoid losing the temper on your metal, you have to just hold it there for 2 seconds and then slide it back. And you need to have positive pressure against the chisel so it's pushing against that ramp when you're sliding it back. If you don't, instead of sliding back, it will fall back like this, and that way the sharp tip of the chisel that you just got perfectly sharp by pressing it against the disc, because you tipped back even slightly, it will round over that edge. So maybe it's just a little bit of sloppiness on the pullback, Walter. That might be what's happening for you. Okay, Keith Short, I have watched brace carving at ukulele factories in Honolulu. The ladies at the Kamaka factory made short work of it. The braces are short, perhaps 2 minutes per top. No effort to voice the tops, which surprised me. In the 1940s and 50s, the factory employed deaf workers as they were less expensive to hire. Yet this is a premium brand used by many famous performers. At the Kanalea ukulele factory, they used engineered lattice bracing. Oh, that's cool. I love lattice bracing, if you guys don't know. Rather complex, looking like a cantilever bridge, laser cut and glued in place. No carving at all. I very much enjoy brace carving though, and I can't say I voice with confidence. I do tap testing of the top, but more as a ritual than as a deterministic process. Well, hey man, that is basically what I do too. I mean, it starts out as a ritual. It has to. You don't have the sort of background experience right away when you first start tapping to make it a deterministic process. So initially you're doing it just to create that first data point in your mind of, okay, I hear what this sounds like. I'm going to kind of remember this, what it sounds and feels like, because flexing is very important. And it's only going to start to make sense by doing iterations of it. So you got to start. You got to just start somewhere. And it sounds like you are. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that there's no effort to voice the tops, even on a premium brand. Voicing really only happens with individual solo luthiers. Well, and I should add, very small companies like Bourgeois and Collings. It happens in those environments when there's, you know, a small team of, I don't know, 15 people or something like that. But these big factory operations, even when it's high end and it's premium, there's just no way to, you know, fit that into the margins, the profit margin there, to have someone actually spend time with it and do all that. Not to mention consistency in that world matters so much, and not just from a output perspective of what the instrument ultimately sounds like, but from a repair and warranty kind of perspective. You don't want to create one-of-a-kind products in a large factory environment. You want some serious consistency. Otherwise, your process actually can fall apart, right? Because every stage before that point and every subsequent stage after that point depends on what happens at that point, right? So if you voice one guitar different from another and then kind of pass it off down the line to the next set of people, without that consistency, things go awry. David Gagnon writes, so if the CPR at the bridge felt very stiff and unyielding, what would you do? What he's talking about is I did a video recently called an overlooked technique in voicing guitars, where it was basically, I was basically describing the fact that within my personal voicing process, I not only tap the top and flex the X-brace arms, but I also place it into the notches on the instrument. After I've cut those notches with the Dremel that we talked about earlier, I will place the top on the guitar. It'll lock right into those notches, so I know it's firmly in the spot it's meant to be once it's glued down. And then I just press gently on that bridge location, almost like I'm giving CPR, and I can feel the liveness of the top by pressing right where that string, the transmission of energy of the strings, is going to translate down into the bridge and into the top. Okay? And again, it's one of those things, it's not quite deterministic, where I don't know exactly what I'm feeling for, but doing this with every single guitar, I start to get a sense for what it's supposed to feel like at that location. And you can even take guitars that aren't yours, the guitars that you purchased from, you know, Martin or whatever, and you can feel that out on those as well. Although I should say it won't be exactly the same, because the bridge itself, which in the case of a finished guitar, the bridge is attached, that bridge is itself a massive brace. So it will actually feel a lot stiffer, all things being the same, once that bridge is in place. And when I'm voicing at that point, the bridge is the only missing brace, because technically the bridge is a brace. It's the only missing brace on the top. So you always have to, in the back of your mind, you're taking that into account, that the bridge is not there. But let me finish his question, because that wasn't the whole question there. So if the CPR at the bridge felt very stiff and unyielding, what would you do? Cut the bracing down some more or start over? Oh, cut the bracing down some more. So that's what it is. What you're doing is you are removing material from primarily the X-brace and the tone bars. In fact, I say primarily, but that's actually all I don't mess with the other little braces, the finger braces or anything like that. It's just the X-brace and the tone bars. And I'm frequently, as I'm lowering those, as I'm taking a little material off the edges with a small finger plane or something like that, I am periodically placing it back on the rim set and just feeling that out, right? And I'm also flexing the X-brace arms and tapping and kind of letting all of that feedback from those three things just, you know, percolate in my mind. Okay. And B Power responded to him saying, I would say rescue breaths into the sound hole. That's funny. Little CPR joke there. But yes, I would say carve the braces down more would give more flex to the top. That's correct. Yeah, so he gave a good answer to you, David. It's definitely not a start over thing. Unless, I guess, if you felt it and it felt way too floppy, then yeah, you went too far. But hopefully that doesn't happen. Okay, Rui Salza writes, hi Eric, a question regarding the large brace around the sound hole. If I'm not mistaken, you put a radius on it so that the whole top is radiused. I thought the top should be flat above the sound hole. If it is radiused even above the sound hole, won't it be difficult to glue on the fretboard extension, which is flat, on that portion of the top, which is radiused? Thanks for the great content. Yeah, this is a great question, actually, and it's kind of hard for me to answer in a way, because I'm doing something a little bit different that I don't really know anybody else is doing, and it's simply that I let the whole top be, I apply the radius to the entire top, whereas most builders I find will leave the transverse bar. That's the brace he called the large brace above the sound hole. That's the transverse bar. Most people I find will leave that flat so that there's a transition from a radiused top. It's very lightly radiused, only, 40 feet or 30 feet in most cases. A light, gently radiused top that gently transitions into a truly flat area where the fretboard tongue ultimately gets glued down. So over time, I have found that in my situation, that flattening that area wasn't necessary. And it's actually a bit difficult to manage that transition between the rims and the braces being radiused on one side, transitioning into flat on the other side. It's not, super difficult. Most people manage it fine, but I think the integrity of the top, again, just structurally, because I've talked many times before about sort of the eggshell concept. The fact that radius is there actually gives strength and support to the whole structure of the top. And so if you flatten it on one portion of the top in the upper bout, I think you're losing a little bit of that. Now, it's probably not significant, but anyway, this is just what goes on in my mind. At some point, I realized that I could still glue the fretboard down and get a perfect or nearly perfect joint there, maybe with a tiny gap at the corner where the neck block and the fretboard come together. I could still get a sufficient joint there, and because I'm radiusing and shaping the fretboard in place after it's all put together, I'm leveling out any sort of little hump or anything that's created by the fact that I'm gluing it to, a fully radius top. It's, what, I want to put it this way. It's one of those things where I do it, but I don't necessarily recommend other people do it. It works for me with the specific type of builds that I'm doing and how I'm doing other parts of the process. It all kind of meshes well together. In fact, in my online course, I teach you to do exactly what you're talking about doing. I teach flattening the upper bout area by leaving the transverse bar flat. So that's what most people do. That's what I recommend. It's tried and true and tested over time. And I just find that it's not necessary in my situation. Okay. So let's see. Scottman60 writes, so my question is, did you do your own bracing layout or did you go off a plan? So my bracing layout for the new parlor guitars that I'm doing is altered from a plan. I use plan, so here's sort of my process for starting a new model, from designing from the beginning a new model of guitars, is I will look up and find the plans that are similar to what I'm trying to achieve. So in this case, it was a parlor guitar, and parlor's kind of a nebulous term, so there's lots of different concepts of what a parlor guitar is, and I ordered several of those plans, and in the early stages of planning, I looked at them all and kind of noticed, okay, what are the consistencies between them? There's going to be differences, but what's kind of the same? And it gives me a general idea of like, okay, this is what works. This is what is sort of tried and true about this model, right? And then the differences between the various plans I kind of throw out. So within that, then I will take basically tracing paper, and I kind of just borrow from the plans the things that I like, and I use the tracing paper also to move things around. So I shifted the X brace in this particular example from existing plans. I borrowed some things and left out other things, and I shifted the X brace, and I changed the size of I always change the size of the end block, because people always have the end block being way too big, I think, on guitars. So I make a much thinner end block, roughly in line with the thickness of the kerfing. And I shift the X brace over a little bit to account for the fact that now there's more space behind the X brace because I changed the end block. And a couple other, little things. I always like to use the cube rule, a la Irvin Samaji, which essentially means I'm using tall and skinny braces, and a lot of these plans I see have wider braces. So that's one thing that I always change right off the bat when I'm adapting from a set of plans. And so that's it. So to answer your question, it's a little bit of both. I am using plans. We're not going to reinvent the wheel here, but in another sense, it's also my own set of plans by the time it's done. Gabor writes, I have watched a few fret removing videos, but yours was the most helpful. I am fixing an old bass guitar and I needed to replace the 0 fret. With the help of this video, I could easily remove it with a soldering iron and a regular wire cutter. Thank you. Okay, yeah, there's no question there. That's just someone thanking me for this video gets a lot of views. It's a simple video showing you how to, the proper way to remove a fret, which is a very common problem, even going beyond people who are interested in building guitars, but simply guitar technicians and repair people need that sort of video. So yeah, I don't have anything to say to that. I guess I'm just sharing what he said. Alan Dust writes, hoping sometime you will go over how to work with clear plastics to make jigs, etc. What are the different types of plastics? Which are the best choice for luthiers? And what tools should or shouldn't we use? This is a good question, and honestly, I'm not the best person to answer this, even though I use acrylic all the time. I have a couple of insights that I've learned along the way, basically through trial and error, but I'm probably doing things wrong in other cases. So I'll tell you what I do know from working with acrylic a good bit. One thing I do know is that there's two types of acrylic. There's cast acrylic and there's non-cast acrylic, okay? I don't remember what the other one's called. So there's regular acrylic and cast acrylic. And cast acrylic is the type of acrylic that you want. I don't remember molecularly exactly what's different, except that what I do know is there's a serious workability difference in that if you use regular acrylic that's not cast, it will, let's say you're shaping it on the bandsaw, which is typically how I'm cutting through acrylics when I'm making these templates, because I'm always using thin material. So I use my small bandsaw with the 1/4 inch blade to cut curves and stuff like that to make, say, a brace pattern template or something like that. And what I've found is if you use non-cast acrylic, as it's cutting, it's actually melting the edges of that acrylic, which one leaves a very just gross and inconsistent edge, right? When it melts and then rehardens, you have kind of these bubbles all around the edges. Doesn't look good. Also, at the same time, it will literally, I've seen it melt the acrylic, and then as I'm advancing the blade, the acrylic that melted behind the blade will start to harden again very quickly, and it can even harden and re-bridge the gap that it just cut. So think about that. You've just cut the acrylic, and as the blade passes, the cut the acrylic between the cut reforms, and you've effectively, you tried to cut it in half, but you still have one piece, right? If that makes sense. So it's a very messy process, and honestly, it just doesn't work. It's not meant to be used in that way. Cast acrylic will cut clean. It doesn't melt when you're drilling into it or cutting it on the bandsaw. I mean, that's my big insight. That's the one thing I learned through trial and error. Other than that, I'm using the bandsaw, I'm using the drill press on acrylic, and that's pretty much it. That's what I use. I use acrylic for my Radial Rosette maker jigs, so I have quite a bit of experience because I make those here in the shop actually, and that's not well, some of it's outsourced to a company that does CNC, but other parts of it I make right here in the shop, and I have to use a lot of acrylic to batch out those jigs. It's a Rosette making jig, by the way, if you guys have never seen this on my website before. That's something that I sell. Okay, what are the different types of plastics? Cast acrylic and non-cast. And there's many plastics. I just know acrylic. Which are the best choice for Luthiers? Okay, so I think I've sufficiently answered that question, but I'm by no means the plastics expert. So somebody else out there, maybe somebody in the comments, is a plastic expert. Let's hear from you. Please comment. Okay. Auditory Storytelling writes, what kind of glue do you use for bracing? I use Titebond Original for almost everything, aside from the few small cases where I use water-thin super glue. Other than that, I'm using Titebond Original for everything at this point. I'm not using hide glue. I like the idea of using hide glue. Honestly, it's just that I never got into it. But when I hear of other people using hide glue, I highly respect that. I think it's a great choice. But Titebond Original is also a good choice. By the way, the difference between using Titebond and using hide glue, the meaningful difference is that with hide glue, it's a little bit more reversible than Titebond, so it's easier to remove things and do repairs, which specifically that's important to use on a lot of builders will use hide glue specifically on the bridge and the fretboard tongue, because those are the things that need to be removed. In the case of the fretboard tongue, at some point a guitar needs a neck reset, so you have to reverse that glue under the fretboard in order to give it a neck reset. If you use Titebond under the fretboard, it's going to be a harder job to remove it, and there's likely going to be more damage to the soundboard area in the process. Whereas if you use hot hide glue, you don't get that much damage and it comes off nice and easy. Same thing with the bridge. If you're doing a bridge reglue, which is also a common repair for guitars, even when they're well built. Now I say all that, and I'm not using hide glue. I might use it in the future. I do think it's a good idea for that reason. It doesn't make your guitar sound better, by the way. That's nonsense. It's just a more reversible glue. Troy Clayton writes, thanks for the video. I haven't yet seen your video on X-bracing a back. I never thought about it. Radiused X-braces bend a top or back in 2 dimensions for a bowl shape, while ladder bracing, parallel only, just makes a trough. But with the sides sanded to a radius, a ladder back needs to be bent into a second arc tension not supported by the braces. I'm not sure what he's saying there. I'm far too ignorant to understand if this is a good thing or not, but I wonder if there could be issues with the skewed parallel ladder braces when the bending force applied along the center line isn't evenly distributed side to side. Okay, so yeah, the bending forces along the center line would be related to the taper that's built into the rims. I'm just trying to understand what he's saying in real time here as I'm reading it. Okay, isn't evenly distributed side to side. Radiused parallel braces bend the back in the plane parallel to their placement. This is usually along the center line. Not so in this guitar. Its reinforced bend is 45-ish. That said, 45-ish degrees, he's saying. That said, there are so many things I don't understand that my words may just be empty air. Plenty of old, poorly built guitars are still sought after. What makes a good sound? Okay. So, right off the bat, one thing I want to say, because he said, what makes a good sound? What makes a good sound, truly, is everything that's going on with your soundboard, with the top. Okay? That's not to say that the back plate doesn't affect it. And in fact, you know, it does affect it, and that's why I do something different than just ladder bracing. But sometimes we get a little lost in the weeds talking about the back plate and what wood we're going to use for the neck and different things that are not the soundboard and the bridge. Because really, the soundboard and the bridge, that's your money maker. That's the sweet spot. That's where most of your impact on the tone is actually happening, and everything else is just kind of like icing on the cake, okay? So keep that in mind, right? It's not something, it's not going to make or break, I think. That's always been my opinion. But even without it being a make or break thing, I do feel that the ladder bracing is, in theory, a smarter choice than the did I say ladder? I meant to say lattice. I do feel that the lattice bracing is the smarter choice over the ladder bracing. And the ladder bracing kind of dominates the industry simply because it's very easy to execute. And that makes sense. So anyway, I understood a little bit of what you were saying there. And that's not to say that anything you were saying was incoherent. It's just I'm kind of reading this right on the spot. I didn't read this before, and sometimes I have to read things a couple times to understand when it gets kind of technical like this. But the beginning of what he was saying about that sort of bowl shape, that is part of the reason why I do the lattice bracing instead of straight ladder bracing, because ladder bracing is supporting the guitar across the grain, but not with the grain. And so you do actually end up, at least in theory, and a little, I can see this on old guitars because they imprint against the braces over time. You do end up almost with like little dishes between where the back braces are located because they're unsupported longitudinally between those braces, okay? Whereas if we make X's like this and do a lattice pattern, we're supported equally in both directions. That's a part of lattice bracing, and I'm just going to leave it at that for now because I don't know, my head's starting to spin just just after reading that one. Some questions are harder on me than other ones. Sean Curran writes, "Thanks, Eric. This is useful information. You didn't tell us how long to leave the bent piece of wood in the machine, though." So he's talking about a video I did on machine bending. Overnight is generally preferred. I have pulled it out much sooner, like 5 hours, I think, is the shortest I've left it in there, and it's been fine. You'll notice if you take it out early that it'll still be very wet. A lot of that moisture won't have evaporated off. A lot of the moisture gets cooked off, but some of it, if you take it out early, it's still in there. But even then, I mean, it's not a big deal. You can dry it off and go on from there. So I would say overnight. Yeah. In certain cases, and I'm not going to get too into this, I've left it for days in there. But that's more special cases with difficult woods and things like that. It depends on what wood you're using, but generally overnight. Okay, Atelier Luthier Gerard writes, sorry for butchering that name there, writes, "Hi, I'm following you, and I have to say that your videos are full of inspiring things and tips. Thanks. I am a French luthier based in French Polynesia, and I always try to improve my skills and knowledge, and your video does the job. I have one question. I hope you'll answer it. Where did you find your insert and the system for hold and push the insert with your hand drill?" Where did you find the insert and the system for hold and push the insert with your hand drill? Any link? I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. So this is for the video I did on creating space for the truss rod. That's a very old video, so I have to think for a moment. Where did you find your insert in the system? I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm just gonna move on from that one. It's probably a good question, but I don't know what he's talking about simply because it's a very old video and I don't remember. Don't remember what I was talking about in that video. Keith Short writes, "Thanks for showing this. I had wondered how the sides of the strip that bond to the plates were made flat. Now I know and see how you inspect for a gap prior to gluing." He's talking about adding a decorative back stripe to your book matched back plate. You know how on a lot of guitars you see a nice stripe down the middle? I made a video on how to do that. After gluing, how much margin do you leave when cutting the outline shape of the guitar? I have been leaving about a 1/2 inch, but am inclined to reduce this to a 1/4 inch so there is less cantilever from the elastic strapping I use when gluing on the back. Yes, less is, well, let me put it this way, less is better. If this is your first guitar, you might want to leave a little bit more just because you might make mistakes in lining things up, but as things become more consistent with your process, I leave anywhere from an 1/8 of an inch to a 1/4 inch extra around the outline of the plate when I'm cutting out that profile. And then of course later on, after it's attached to the rim set, I trim off all that extra bit. But there's no need to have like a 1/2 inch or more than that dangling off the edges. It just makes it harder to trim back. And like he's mentioning, it can cause problems, so that cantilever effect, because he's using like a strapping with rubber bands method for attaching his plates, okay? I use clamps to attach my plates, so I don't have that problem, but certainly if you are using rubber bands for that step, you will run into that problem if you have too much overhang. So, yeah, I would say an 1/8 of an, he says a 1/4 inch. I mean, you can go as close as you're comfortable with without running the risk of undershooting. Okay, so that's what the overhang is about. It's just a little bit of extra oh shit space if you mess up the alignment. David Morris writes, very helpful explanation. Thanks for posting. What grit do you use on your sanding board for final cleaning the ebony maple sandwich piece? The ebony maple sand, I'm just using my finest grit board, which is 180 grit. That's my like smoothing grit for it. And I'm not really, when I'm cleaning these up, I'm just kind of getting the excess purfling strip that's sticking up. I'm trying to level that and get some of the glue off. I'm not trying to make this look smooth because it doesn't need to be yet. It's just going to get installed and then leveled again at that point. And at that point, once it's leveled, then it'll be smoothed and all of that. So I'm not trying to make this look perfect. I just need some of the extra material taken down, and I can do that real quick with just a finger plane, and then like I showed, just laying out my sanding board and pulling the strips across it, Hymn player writes, Happy New Year. It's it's February now, but these are old. I'm sure he said that at the right time. I'm reading old comments. Happy New Year. Thanks for another enjoyable video. I really like your shop. Your cam clamp bench clamp is cam clamp bench clamp. I'm not sure what that is. It's pretty cool. My son and I have built 6 guitars between us with minimal tools. My son is a mechanical engineer and has a get her done approach to any project he tackles. My approach is to think about it and think about it, read about it, watch more videos about it, buy more Stu Mac and LMI stuff, all the while slowly building a guitar, mostly at the kitchen table over at least a year's time. I also was working swing shift and night shift at the time, which didn't help. It would be interesting for you to explain how you developed your somewhat unique bracing pattern if you haven't already done so in a previous video. I'm not sure which bracing pattern he's talking about exactly, but I actually have explained it in this exact video, in a previous question, hymn player. So I won't go into that again, but I will comment on what you said about your son having the get her done attitude. That's funny because I think my natural temperament is more like your son. I can feel like almost like an anxiety building up when things are going too slow, and I like to just tick things off my checklist, right? I like to keep moving and moving like a little bit fast, which is not normally what you want in this line of work, right? It's all about patience and not not wasting more time by rushing, because that's the problem when you have that get her done attitude, is you tend to make more mistakes and then have to backtrack. And so that's a balance that I always have to find, and I always have to sort of temper myself and slow myself down, because naturally I do want to just like get it done. During the research phase of things, I always feel like I have to force myself to slow down and continue that research, because I think that is the appropriate way to do it. Whereas I might read a couple steps ahead, and then, you know, my natural inclination would be to then say, okay, I've learned enough, I'm just going to get started and see what happens. But honestly, there's value in both approaches, because if you can make more mistakes more quickly and iterate more quickly, you learn more from the mistakes than you do from simply reading about the possibility of the mistakes, if that makes sense. So different strokes for different folks, though. That's, you know, just a little spiel I wanted to make about temperaments and how we're all trying to find a balance between the get her done attitude and the slow, meticulous research attitude, which can easily devolve into procrastination, right? We've all done that, where you research something so hard that you just get analysis paralysis, and then you basically never complete the project. So it's all about balance, people. Eric Signs writes, "Forget and forgive my ignorance. What is the radius on the back of the guitar for? What is the difference against a flat guitar?" Okay, so the radius, what is the radius on the back for? Now, I've answered this a lot. I'll go ahead and answer it again, but this is such a common question. I answer it in like every Q&A. The radius on the back of the guitar is for structure. It prevents things. So wood is hygroscopic and it will move. So you will get splits and things like that if you don't have any radius whatsoever on your guitar. You're not going to get splits right away, but over time that wood's going to want to move. And if there isn't some doming in the plate, it can very easily move in a sunken direction, which structurally causes all kinds of problems with braces separating and splits and things like that. So you need some kind of radius on your back plate. Beyond that, it doesn't matter if it's a 25-foot radius or a 15-foot radius, just that you have a radius. Now, the reason why bigger radii exist is because a lot of people are under the belief, including myself, that the more doming you have on the plate, the more that gives it more structure. So you don't need as much bracing or as stout of braces to support that structure, right? I've said this before, but a chicken egg is actually a very strong shape. It's hard to crush a chicken egg with your hands. You think of chicken eggs as fragile only because the material is brittle and fragile. So if you tap it on the edge of a table, it breaks. But if you squeeze it, it's actually quite strong. And that's what we want on a guitar. We want the strength from the dome, which allows us to use less bracing, which means less mass on the plate, which means the plate is more responsive. Okay, and he says, "Greetings from Chile. Happy New Year." I love hearing where you guys are from, by the way. Someone said they're from French Polynesia, and that's amazing. That, I don't know, that makes me want to travel. That just sounds like a fun place. Anyway, I'm going to end it off right there. That was a lot of questions. We did a lot right there. Yeah. I think I might do more long Q&As like this. I actually enjoy this. You know, you guys can let me know if you like the longer Q&As too, and we'll go from there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get to work. First thing I got to do is cut some binding channels and cut the purfling channels on guitars 86 and 87, my 2 parlor guitars, and you guys will be seeing more videos on that. So without further ado, see you guys in the next one. Bye for now. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.